The Bible is full of events in history. These are real events that took place to people like us, and therefore we can identify with what we read. But as we read these stories, the story is not so much about these different individuals as it is about God himself. As he reveals himself, who he is, what he does, what his character is like. And as we read about cases like this with Ruth, we find out who God is and how he acts, and the concern that he has for his people. As we look at that evidence, we're aware that God is indeed there. There was an apologist by the name of Francis Schaeffer who lived during the end of the last century, and he wrote more than a couple of books, but he wrote a couple of books whose titles are The God Who Is There, affirming that there is a God there, and then he wrote a follow-up to that, He is there and he is not silent. In other words, not only is he there, he's made himself known. And of course, as we look around us, as we see what there is around us, we are aware of God's existence, both through the creation that we see, through the things that we experience, but especially through the word that he has revealed to us. And so he is indeed there. Now, the other possibility is that he's not there. And if he's not there, then there is no God who is in control. And all that happens is really very pointless, no purpose to what takes place. And it's very random, just a bunch of isolated incidents that are occurring. But if God does exist, his purpose exists. He is intent upon the redemption of mankind, and he has acted with that in mind. And if we have a confidence that he is there and that he is concerned about us, that he's doing what he can, then that leaves us with some hope that no matter how miserable or messy life might become for us at times, that there's a God there that gives us hope, that as we serve him, we can trust him and rely upon him. And so we're going to look this evening at this last chapter in Ruth, and I've just entitled this, that God is indeed at work. God is a powerful God. He is a majestic God. He is an all-knowing God. He is a wise God, and being all of those things, he is working behind the scenes to bring about his will. We sometimes talk about providence. The idea of providence, among other things, is providing for the needs that we have. And of course, we can only see at a certain level. We can't know, as God does, the spiritual dimension that exists there. But again, we're confident that God does exist, and that through these abilities that he has, he is producing his good, and he is glorifying us and glorifying himself in the things that he has accomplished. And so the end of the story is that Ruth ends well, and we'll see that in a few moments. But as we've already talked about, she experiences a number of setbacks along the way. So let's just go back and very quickly review what we've seen up to this point. In chapter 1, we are introduced to Elimelech and Naomi, his wife, and he takes his wife and their 2 sons, and they move to Moab because there's a famine in Bethlehem. Ironically, the house of bread is no more. And so they go to not just a foreign land, but a land that is known for its idolatry, like all the nations around Israel were. That's the very reason that God allowed Israel to come in and to take that land. And so they travel on to Moab, but there Elimelech dies, and his 2 sons end up marrying Moabite women. But after 10 years, there are no grandchildren. And then both sons die. We're not really told anything about that, but I can only imagine that their deaths must have been unexpected. That's not normally what would happen. maybe even tragic. We really don't know. But we do know that at some point in time, Naomi, in her situation, hears that there is food back in Bethlehem, and so she determines to return home. And so despite her protests, Ruth, one of her daughters-in-law, is determined to go back with her, to be loyal to her, really to renounce the gods of her nation and to put her trust in Jehovah God. And so she follows Naomi back. And when Naomi returns, well, it seems like at the end of chapter 1, she's in a bad place. She's empty and she's bitter from the experiences that she's had. And we can only imagine or think what that might be like. Or maybe we know of situations like these and we can understand how she might have felt like she did. Even though Jehovah God was this covenant God, it seems as though he was against her. And it's hard at that point to imagine anything being resolved in her life. That's how chapter 1 ends. And so here's this journey they would have made, about 50 miles. That doesn't seem so much, but that's kind of rugged terrain there in the southern portion of Israel, and crossing over into Moab there across to the east side of the Dead Sea. And so she lived there for a time, and then, as we say, she returns with her daughter-in-law, Ruth. So chapter 2 begins, and Ruth and Naomi are back in Bethlehem, back at Naomi's home, but with really no way to support themselves, no money, no husbands, no food. And Ruth is in that situation. And so Ruth, it seems, has understood that God's plan is that someone in need can act in order to provide for that need. And so she does act. She goes out into the field and gleans. She meets Boaz, who is this godly and kind and respectful man, and ends up being related to Ruth's in-laws. And Boaz indeed shows kindness. In fact, he protects Ruth and shows concern for her and provides for her and her mother-in-law. And so it seems as if there is hope on the horizon for this situation. But Boaz is rather slow to act. For whatever reason, nothing really happens. And so we get to chapter 3. And chapter 3 opens with Naomi and Ruth acting again. This time it seems that Naomi spawns the thinking here and tries to prompt, I guess we would say, Boaz into some kind of action. And so Ruth goes to Boaz and asks him, in effect, to be their kinsman redeemer. According to Leviticus 25, there is a provision in the law by which God allows his people, if they have had to give up their land for one reason or another, perhaps because of hardship, that at some point in time they're able to gain it back. And that would be the role of the nearest relative to them. There is also a provision, we'll say a little more about this in a moment, but also provision for a woman widowed with no children. And the law, Deuteronomy 25, as I say, we'll look at that in a moment, allows for the closest unmarried male relative to marry that widow so that the family name can continue. So among other things, God is caring for his people. He gives them this land. He gives them a way by which they can regain that land if they have lost it. And he allows for each family not to be wiped out if something should happen to them. And so as we close chapter 3, Boaz intends to act, but he's aware that there's someone closer than he is to this family, who has, I guess, the right of first refusal, we would say, who is first in line as the kinsman redeemer. And so we left off last time with Naomi and Ruth waiting. And sometimes, as we said, that's hard to do. And so we turn to chapter 4 to read the rest of the story. So let's start there in chapter 4. And notice that, well, they don't really have to wait very long, because Boaz maybe doesn't even rest that entire evening. He goes to the gate of the city the following morning. Verse 1 of chapter 4, now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, turn aside, friend, sit down here. And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, sit down here. So they sat down. Well, what's taking place here? Again, maybe it's providential that this man happens to come along, this man who has the first right to redeem Naomi and her family. Or maybe it is that Boaz knows that this is a frequent occurrence and he goes there. It is the case that the city gate was a place where people would gather to transact business. If you look back at some of the archaeological finds, you'll find gates of cities that have been uncovered. And then there are places where they've actually made a place in which others could gather and sit right there by the gate. Kind of like what the county courthouse used to be, maybe in little towns that were out in the country. Not so much the case these days. But you can imagine the people getting together, gathering, and talking over business and making deals. And so as he anticipates this connection with the close relative, one who has a legal claim on Naomi and Ruth, he has this exchange with him. And apparently it's a case where he calls him by a rather sort of nebulous friend, kind of like you'd say, well, old what's his name? Just not mentioned. We don't really know who this is. I don't know if he didn't know his name, we're not told, but at any rate, he knows of him, he knows his situation. And so he asks him about this matter. Verses 3 and 4, then he said to the Redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. Now let me just stop there and note with you that it says Naomi is selling this land. How can that be? I thought Naomi was this destitute individual who doesn't have any land. Well, it seems as if Boaz is speaking in the sense that, yes, it's hers ultimately to do something with. It has been granted to her and her family. And so it is made available, and he seems to be using that language in an accommodative way. It's available to be redeemed. And so verse 4, so I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me, that I may know, for there's no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you. So he's asking this person about the land. She is the one who has the rights to this land. And so he is seeking this other one who has the right of first refusal. And he does this, of course, in front of witnesses, I think, in order to make this a matter of public record. That's very common in what we do today in some manner or some form to make sure that individuals know about it. And so the Redeemer, verse 4, at the end of verse 4, simply says, I will redeem it. Interesting. And so Boaz goes one step further. He says in verse 5, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. Now, where did that come from? What's that all about? Well, there is, as I stated a little bit earlier, a law that existed in the book of Deuteronomy that had to do with the husband of a woman dying and that widow being left in that situation and providing for someone else to help her, to marry her, and to raise up an inheritance to that name. Over in Deuteronomy 25, let's just read a few verses. This is referred to as the Levirate law. It's from the Latin word lever, L-E-V-I-R, and that is the extent of my knowledge of the Latin language. But apparently that word means brother-in-law, so it's become known as the Levirate law. But in Deuteronomy 25, it reads this way, verse 5, if brothers dwell together, and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead man shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. But why would that be? Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her as his wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And the first son whom she bears shall succeed to the name of his dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. There's the concern. What's going to happen to this family? What's going to happen to the name of this family? We might think of that in passing today. We might observe over several generations that maybe that happens to a particular family because of the offspring that they have or don't have, that ultimately there is no longer someone from that family that exists. But this was a matter of importance to them, so much so that God allowed for this to happen, in fact, planned for this, in order that that inheritance not die out, that name not be blotted out. And just to read on there in Deuteronomy 25, if the man does not wish to take his brother's wife, then his brother's wife shall go up to the gate to the elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to perpetuate his brother's name in Israel. He will not perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. So there was some kind of consequence attached to that in terms of a concern about that family being perpetuated. So this closest unmarried male was expected to marry the widow in order to perpetuate an heir and the rights that went with it. Now, technically, there's really no connection or obligation to marry Ruth. In other words, this situation doesn't exactly fit what we just read in Deuteronomy 25, but it seems as if, whatever the case, traditions, whatever the case, that these two things have converged in this particular situation. Maybe that was the practice at the time. And so there's a concern on the one hand for the genealogical line through the Levirate law, and on the other hand, this estate that was being passed down from one family to another because of the land that was involved that had to do with this redeemer, the Hebrew term goel. And so both of these things seem to be at play here. Now, Boaz has approached this man who has the right of first refusal, asking him about this. And it seems as if he had this man that had first choice, at least four options. We're not told anything about his situation. We don't know. We could only speculate about, did he have a family? Was he already set? Did he have land? Did he have grape? We don't know. But as this transaction is offered to him, it seems he could have done one of four things. First of all, he could have acted not necessarily being legally bound by this, but he might have accepted his moral responsibility and said, I'll do that. I'll redeem the land, and I'll also accept and marry Ruth and ensure the well-being of Naomi. That would be an honorable action. A second possibility that someone has suggested is he could have said, yes, I want to redeem the field, and I pledge to marry Ruth, but then reneged later on marrying Ruth. And he might have ended up with the land in that case, but you can imagine that would jeopardize his reputation, his standing in the community. But at least that could have been an option. Or three, he could have just rejected the offer, ceded the rights of the land and the name of the deceased to Boaz, because Boaz was the one who was following after him. And that would not necessarily be irresponsible on his part to do so. Again, we just don't know what the situation is. I've heard some who say, well, this man was just a weasel. He wasn't doing what he should do. Well, I don't know that that's the case. Fourthly, he could have redeemed the field and then rejected his right to marry Ruth, but that might have put him in jeopardy, because if Ruth had married and produced an heir, he might have lost that land that he thought he had gained. Well, whatever the situation was, he decides for option number 3. At first sight, he said, yes, I'll redeem her. But then when Boaz makes all of this made known, he decides that he will not. Look at verse 6. Then the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Now, maybe that's some indication of what he was thinking about here, something to do with himself or his own family or the possessions that he had. But he says, take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. I'm passing on this, is what he says. And so the sale is transacted. Verse 7. This was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, he drew off his sandal. Now that seems kind of strange to us. We have other ways of noting a transaction, but that's the way that they did it. And then it's acknowledged before these witnesses, verse 9, then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses this day that I've bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and to Mahlon. And then verse 10, Boaz professes his desire to marry Ruth and perpetuate the name of Elimelech. Verse 10, also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, that was her husband, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead is in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers, and from the gate of his native place, you are witnesses this day. So whatever we might not know about that first man, Boaz exercises his right, his duty, his responsibility, his obligation. And then listen to how the people respond, verses 11 and 12. Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. Of course, those were Jacob's wives that produced the sons by which the nation of Israel existed. And they're calling upon God, asking him to bless this household in the same way. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman. So they're asking God's help and God's blessing. Remember, Ruth had not had any children yet. Though married for those 10 years, she and her husband had not had any children. And now the request is that God bless them. Well, look at verse 13. The story continues. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went in to her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. And so God blesses them with a son. The narrator telescopes this period of time after Ruth and Boaz are joined together, and they have this son, and God blesses them. And then listen to the blessing pronounced by these women in verses 14 and 15. Then the women said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. And so the story has a happy ending. Ruth is able to bear a child, and this child is looked upon as an answer to her needs, certainly. Better than 7 sons is this daughter-in-law who remained loyal to Naomi. Can you imagine how Naomi must have felt? These might have been the same women who heard her when she returned back to Bethlehem from Moab saying, call me bitter. And so there had been loss for Naomi. Now there is gain. There had been death. And now there is this life. And so in verses 16 and 17, Naomi holds this child. And it says, she took the child and laid him on her lap, became his nurse. And so, of course, she was a grandmother, typical grandparent. A great joy at this blessing that they had received. Her future was so much greater than she could have imagined only a few months before. The tables certainly have turned. God's provided for her and for her household through these wonderful blessings that have been a part of these things. And so the women announced the birth of his child. Verse 17, and the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. So as great as the blessing was for Naomi and for Ruth and for Boaz and for all the joy that they experienced, the writer sees that there is a greater scope to this picture than just this family. And of course, we know as a result of this book that her grandson, Naomi's grandson, would become the grandfather of the greatest king in Israel, King David. And so here is that lineage. If you can see all of that, there is Ruth in this lineage, a Moabitess. Matthew makes a point in his genealogy of mentioning her as one of the few women that is mentioned in that genealogy as having a part in bringing forth King David, but of course not just King David. At the end of the chapter, we're given this genealogy, and we know from Matthew's account that, of course, David became the king to whom God made the great promise that he would have a son who would sit and rule upon his throne forever, Jesus Christ. And so, who could have imagined that 1,000 years after this birth in the town of Bethlehem, the King of Kings would be born? And that was the story of God's redemption, really the biggest storyline. He became the Savior of all mankind. We sometimes sing Joy to the World. It's a great song to sing. Joy to the world, the Lord has come. And indeed, he did come. He came through the lineage as God had predicted he would. When he came, he was this perfect Son of God who became the sacrifice for sin by his death and then by his glorious resurrection. Could Naomi imagine that, holding this little child in her hands? Could she imagine what this child would ultimately produce and how all of that would be a part of God's grand scheme to save mankind? I'm sure she couldn't. Which is to say that God is at work. He was at work in her life. He is at work in our lives in terms of bringing about this purpose of salvation, bringing about this purpose of blessing by which we can have that salvation. And so I'd like to conclude with these thoughts, that as we think about the birth of this child, that we realize our lives are a journey. Have you ever gone on a trip? And it's not this commute that you've made before or this well-traveled path that you've made before. You're going on a trip to someplace you've never been before. How do those trips sometimes go? Well, nowadays we've got phones and we've got GPS, and those things help a lot. But you can plan that out all that you want. But as soon as you start on that journey, what happens? Well, maybe you take a wrong turn here, or this place isn't where you thought it was going to be, and suddenly you're back and forth this way and that way. It's like taking a trip in a car, and it's not just a nice smooth road the whole way. There are detours, and there are dirt roads, and there are hairpin curves along the way. Life is not necessarily a straight line. Now, God's given us a straight line by which to guide our lives. But there are any number of things that can happen to us along that road of life. And again, think of these individuals. Naomi had lost her husbands, her sons, but God gave her Ruth. Ruth and Naomi needed a redeemer, and along comes Boaz to provide for them in this wonderful way. And then childless Ruth marries Boaz, and God grants a son through whom ultimately the Redeemer of the world would come. He fulfilled their lives, but he fulfilled his plan by doing that. And I suppose one thought is that our lives are important. I believe that God is concerned with us, but we're all part of a bigger plan, a bigger story than just ourselves. It is God's plan of redemption. And I don't want to close without thinking of Boaz, noting that, our lives have twists and turns. Our trust in God is essential along the way. A belief that his ways are best, that when we serve him and do his will, it's going to be good for us. Maybe things don't always happen as we would wish them to, but there is a blessing in our service to God. And finally, his work blesses both us and the human race. Think of Boaz showing this character that God honors. He does the right thing, maybe the hard thing, at a stage in life, really where he's an older man, but he steps forward and acts. He's willing to show his love to this outcast. He rescues Ruth. He befriends her. And in doing so, he shows us what God's love is like as far as we are concerned. We are the outcasts whom God has acted toward and who has been benevolent to. And so as we think about this grand story, the redemption that God works, here is a little tiny glimpse of that in the life of one family, and yet it illustrates what our God is capable of doing and what he's willing to do for us. We want to end this evening with an invitation to rest in Jesus. He is the one who is our Redeemer. Think of Boaz. As a Redeemer, he had to be related to be this kinsman Redeemer. He had to pay the price that was necessary. I don't know what that was, but there was some kind of price to pay. And he had to be willing to redeem us. That's precisely what God has done through his Son, Jesus Christ. He has been willing to pay the price that was necessary in order to redeem us. If you're here this evening, if you have not been saved from your sins, this is an opportunity to respond to that gospel message and to have that forgiveness that God has planned for since the beginning of time. If that's your desire, won't you come as together we stand and sing this